Hi, we're here with Dr. Shahram Ahari, who has experience on both sides of pharmaceutical marketing to physicians. Shahram, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
To start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in the pharmaceutical industry?
Sure. I became a drug rep for Eli Lilly shortly after college, selling Prozac and Zyprexa in their neuroscience division. I was a biochem major, and I was told that the job itself would entail discussing academics, basic science with physicians, pros and cons of one medication over another in some sort of intellectual discourse. What I learned in the process was that really the job was more about influencing and manipulating physician prescribing practices. Since then, since leaving the industry, I've worked in public health. I was a toxicological epidemiologist. I did work in biodisaster preparedness. I went from grad school to medical school, and now I'm an emergency medicine doctor. And I still see the effects of pharmaceutical marketing on a routine clinical practice.
What was your training like to prepare you to be a pharmaceutical promoter?
It was pretty interesting, actually. They start off with shadowing of physicians, particularly in the field where you'll be selling your market. I worked a lot with psychiatrists. And then there was a pretty extensive training course back at the company's HQ, learning a perspective of the science and pharmacology in a way that helps you sell the product. And you learn it in a way that helps you put your medication in the best possible light in comparison with your competitors in the field. And so you get this skewed perspective of the medicine, of the science. And quite frankly, it was pretty interesting. I was the only person in my sales group of, I think, about 20 other trainees and 2 instructors who had any college-level science education. So really the hiring process focuses on people who are able to sell, people who are eloquent or charismatic or really sort of engaging. That training experience was pretty interesting in that it really kind of gives you into this sort of zealous mindset, drinking the Kool-Aid, if you will, not to be too cynical about it, where at the end of the training process, you really feel that you'll be helping the world by getting more patients on your medications. All you have to do is educate a couple of doctors who just are clueless about how great your drug is.
So what strategies did you use to sell your drugs?
There are a lot of different tactics, but the underlying strategy is to find what motivates your physician and their prescribing practices and to influence their preferred style. That kind of requires a little bit of explanation. Part of our training was a corporate psychological deconstruction. We learned a little bit about who we were as people, what sort of personality traits and quirks we have. And by extension, we also learned how to deconstruct our clients, our targets, our physicians. There are some physicians who are focused on data, they're academically oriented. So for those folks, we tended to try to influence them with information, typically journal-styled articles, often industry-sponsored with a particular slant and a focus on the data that's relevant to our product and puts it in the best possible light. Other physicians were more social, and it's cultivating that friendship and really putting that as the premier focus of our relationship, where the discussion was rarely about the product and more about just extending a hand of attention towards them. It wasn't a patient, wasn't someone who was seemingly trying to get anything out of them. It was just a welcome reprieve who often came with food and gifts. And once that relationship was established, then along the way you can leverage that for more prescriptions. It wasn't just about getting more Prozac than there were other drugs like Effexor or Celexa, but it was also to just get more people on the drug. And there are other tools we had in our armamentarium that helped us influence the doctors. I mentioned, while friendship was core, gift giving is a big element of it as well. In some cases, you might construe a journal article, again, published by our company as a gift, but also there are free samples. There's meals. When I was a drug rep, trips to academic conferences were fairly common and almost invariably to somewhere warm and pleasant. Not that that lended itself to its academic credibility, but it made it a whole lot more enjoyable for the doctor. Since then, there's been some curbing on the gift giving. But the strategies are still there and the gift giving still exists.
In this environment, how did you distinguish yourself as a sales representative?
So I don't think that I was especially successful in any way other than knowing which physicians were going to like me and which ones weren't. And to that end, most drug reps are often paired in a territory, oftentimes with 2 people who are pretty distinctly different from each other so that one of them can foster a relationship with the client. In other words, a doctor might like me more than they might like my partner, or vice versa. And we both don't need to be that physician's friend, as long as one of us can establish that friendship and leverage that for the influence. And common practice among sales in general, but notably useful in pharmaceutical sales, is the good cop, bad cop routine, where if the target physician prefers my partner as opposed to me, I can come in with a heavy-handed hard sell, make myself kind of a nuisance, so that by comparison, when my partner comes to visit, their company is much more welcome, much more appreciated. It's a welcome reprieve from my grating, abrasive attitude.
And the target, the physician, doesn't know you two are working in tandem.
No, in fact, they don't. We actually have laptops that we use to review before we go into every meeting and encounter with the physician. And we document what we discuss, what topics were addressed, any sort of important information about the physician, and it gets uploaded to the database so that everyone in our company has that information about the target. So that when our partner goes into the physician's practice, they can review what was discussed and what happened from my encounter 2 weeks before. And I have to say, it's not necessarily about the physician's perspectives on medications, but it could be a lot of personal information as well. Is the physician's children's birthday next week? So that even though the physician told me, my partner comes in with the cake 2 weeks later, the physician is never really tipped off to wonder why my partner knows about this. They just think that we're just very conscientious, and when in fact it's now established in a record and it's going to be there available for us for every year that we see that client. We have that personal bit of information that we can use again to leverage that relationship.
And I think one thing that people probably don't understand is how sophisticated, how empirical this marketing is. And you mentioned this laptop of data. There's also prescribing data that you have ready access to as well.
Yeah, this was very powerful information. And again, this is one of the best kept secrets in the industry up until a few years ago. When physicians write a prescription about a patient, that information gets collected by data mining companies. It gets stripped of any personal information about who received that prescription and what for, but it does associate the physician with their prescribing. What medications are they prescribing? How often are they prescribing it? What drugs do they prefer? What are they using more and more often and less often of? And that information often is at our fingertips, to the extent that we know physicians' prescribing practices, the hard numbers of what they're prescribing, far better than the doctors themselves. And we could use that information to tell us, did that dinner that we took them out to last month help? I see my numbers are going up and my competitors are going down. There's a good association. It seems like taking this physician out to dinner does consciously or subconsciously change their prescribing practices.
So what would you say are the biggest drawbacks of pharmaceutical marketing to physicians?
That's a big question. As I mentioned earlier, pharmaceutical marketing doesn't just aim to capture market share. It looks to expand the market, meaning it encourages physicians to prescribe brand name medications, not only in patients that can definitely benefit, but also for patients that supposedly can also potentially benefit. Prescribe my drug all the time for all the patients you think could use it, and maybe for the patients who don't necessarily need to use it, but maybe could work. So it creates a culture of aggressive prescribing among physicians. And the idea is to get doctors to be, the term we used in industry was to be more cowboy, to be more at the cutting edge of medicine, to use these brand new medications, when we really don't have a solid grasp on how effective or how dangerous they are. So you're prescribing more, you're prescribing expensive drugs, you don't have a clear sense of how effective or how dangerous they are. All those have an ultimate cost, and you're not necessarily using the most reliable information. If much of the information we have about these medications are sponsored by industry, while a lot of it is useful, some of it is suspect, and it's hard to parse out what's reliable and what's not. On top of that, even before I became a physician, the misgivings I had about the job can probably be condensed down to one or two simple questions. How would I feel if my doctor prescribed me a medication that I knew was made by the same company that took him to a fancy dinner last night? I'll tell you, the vast majority of physicians I know are ethical, want to do what's right by their patients, but the vast majority of doctors have a lack of appreciation of how sophisticated and how effective this marketing mechanism influences their prescribing practices. There's a joke that's pretty common in industry. 90% of physicians feel they graduated in the top half of their class. And this is an attitude that drug reps are taught to cultivate. They would say things like, "Doctor, how can I possibly influence you? I have an undergraduate degree in English. You were top of your class in college. You went to 4 years of medical training. You did 3 years of residency. You know your stuff." But the fact of the matter is, when it comes down to it, a lot of pharmaceutical prescribing patterns are dictated not necessarily by the data about the science, but the relationship you have with your patients, with your drug reps, with that company. And again, it's like that orchestra when all these different instruments are pushing you towards a certain perspective on a medication, and invariably embeds itself in your psyche, and you think it to be cutting edge information and a tool to help guide how you practice.
So now you're on the other side as a practicing physician. How has that shaped your opinion of physician marketing?
Well, that's a tough question. I think that I'm as conscious of it, of how marketing influences my education as I was before. But it's hard. It's hard to filter out marketing from message. So as a doctor now, I'm aware that the marketing still influences me. And I recognize that it's still difficult to suss out what's marketing versus what's data. I guess what I mean by that is that data source may seem to come from a reliable, objective reference, an academic institution from such and such a place, and then conflicts of interest, you realize that it's industry sponsored, and then makes you wonder, is there any sort of subtext to this? It's hard. It's hard to figure out what's consistently reliable information, and what it's done is actually make me cautious, at the very least, not to be cavalier about trying new remedies or new treatments until they've been out in market for a while, until I know that they're fairly reliable, or at least we have a reliable set of information. It's not to the extent that I need to be paranoid, but it is to the extent that I feel like we don't have enough consistently reliable information that's effectively vetted that makes me want to look at a single study and say, this is fantastic. It looks like this is the drug that's going to be the miracle that we've been looking for. I've spoken to colleagues about this, and there's some who'll push back and say, look, there is no clear line between objective truth and marketing. And I agree, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to get to as much objectivity and certainty as we can in our studies.
Thanks.
Thank you.